Hello everyone, I'm Neil Wilkins and I lead the Migrant Workers Programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. This webinar is one of a number at this year's Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment that focuses on remedy, and it's right that it should do so. The UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights make clear the expectations on states and businesses with regard to human rights in business operations. And the third pillar is, of course, access to effective remedy when the guiding principles are breached. And to quote the principles, where business enterprises identify that they have caused or contributed to adverse impacts, they should provide for or cooperate in their remediation through legitimate processes. Now, this discussion is an opportunity to learn from the experience of Top Glove, the leading global manufacturer of rubber gloves, whose products are sold all over around the world. And they're going to explain about what it actually means to remedy forced labour. This session will talk about their journey from a US import ban to the establishment of a transparent, large-scale remedy programme, bringing direct benefit to tens of thousands of workers. And now for that company to have an ongoing focus on ESG. I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists. Firstly, Melissa Chu is the financial controller at Top Glove. Melissa will bring that important employer's perspective. We have Pauline Gothberg, who is the national coordinator for the National Secretariat for Sustainable Public Procurement for the Swedish County Councils and Regions. And Pauline will discuss the role of buyers and how they can make a difference. And finally, we have Rosie Hurst, who is the Director of Impact. And Rosie will bring insights on emerging standards and the ever-increasing regulatory and societal expectations placed on companies. Now, before we begin the webinar, however, I just wanted to explain a little about a key feature of this particular discussion, withhold release orders. So the United States Customs and Border Protection may use withhold release orders, WROs, or formal findings to enforce a prohibition on goods deemed to be the products of forced labour. Over the last few years, we've seen an increase in the number of WROs being issued. Imported goods destined for the USA are being more heavily scrutinised for evidence that forced labour was present in their supply chain. If an importer is issued a WRO, the goods will be denied entry or seized until the importer is able to affirmatively show that the goods were not, in fact, produced with forced labour. So that's just something on WROs to start our discussion. But first, I'm going to ask Pauline. Pauline, can you explain a little bit about the Swedish public procurement's approach to forced labour? And in particular, do you think that people have an accurate understanding of what that actually means in global supply chains?
Well, thank you, Neil, for the invitation. I mean, public procurement is really about the strategic purchase of goods and services. And we have an obligation to do that to the best value for money for citizens. But value for money is not only about economic value and lowest price. Value includes other values such as, human rights, labor rights, and forced labor that we're talking about today. The Swedish regions, are responsible for public healthcare, and it's very difficult. I mean, we cannot conduct healthcare in Sweden if it is to the detriment of people's health in our supply chain. So the state's obligation, exactly as you said, also extends to protecting human rights and also through public procurement. It is a very powerful policy instrument to achieve social and environmental goals. I mean, considering that public procurement accounts for nearly 15% of GDP, the public sector has a great leverage through its joint power to actually stimulate, a faster transition. But you asked me if people have an accurate understanding of what forced labor is. No, I think in general, I don't think they have. But then I'm not sure that, patients in hospitals should should have to, because I mean they should really be able to trust that the surgical instruments, or in this case medical gloves, are actually being produced, not produced by forced labor. So procurement agencies has a great responsibility to ensure that this, they have their own due diligence process to identify and mitigate risks. And talking about risks, many of the products that we buy are being manufactured in countries where there is a high risk for human rights violation and where corruption is high. So we do our risk analysis for all our procurement categories, and we have identified medical gloves as one. So the problem with forced labor, for example, I mean, including excessive working hours and confiscated passports and recruitment fees, whereas, migrant workers might even be in debt before they even started a job, it's an industry-wide problem and has been for years. So together with our Nordic colleagues, we put provision in for forced labor, due diligence requirements. We coordinate monitoring of agreements. So including these requirements are absolutely necessary, but it's far from sufficient. You also need to follow up on those commitments. I just want to finish off with one maybe challenge to put this into context, because we never or very seldom procure directly from brand owners. So we normally procure from Swedish wholesalers or sales offices. So our requirements are directed at them, and they should in turn forward these to their sub-suppliers. And we are very much dependent on their transparency, but also their leverage to influence their sub-suppliers and act if there's any violations found in the supply chain. So even if we buy for 15 billion euros a year, we are a small buyer on a global scale, but our suppliers are even smaller. So their leverage is even lower than ours. So we have seen progress over the years. I mean, several suppliers have implemented zero cost policies, for example, but that is very much forward looking. So talking about repayment of current or past recruitment fees, I have to admit that this has not even been discussable.
Thank you, Pauline. And I think that what you describe is a situation that's common to many companies and to many buyers, that they sort of lack leverage over their supply chain and lack visibility over the supply chain very often. As well. And even what we would consider to be quite significant buyers of goods and services sometimes simply aren't able to undertake the effective due diligence needed to ensure that best practice is being enforced throughout their supply chains. I'll turn now to Melissa. Melissa, Top Glove are one of Malaysia's leading companies. So can you describe the day when you first heard about the US withhold release order on goods produced by your company? What were your immediate thoughts?
Hello, Neil, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on the panel to speak and to share our experience. Good to see both of you, Pauline and Rosie. 15 July 2020, that fateful day, still remember. A day of shock and disbelief for everyone in the company. And we were trying to grasp and understand what actually happened. And I still remember, because of the 12-hour difference between Malaysia and the US Eastern Standard Time, we had one full day, but it was the longest day to try and get hold of someone in the US, at Washington, D.C., to understand what actually happened. And thankfully, I call it thankfully because prior to us, there was another Malaysian company who had received a good assistance from Rosie's company. This other company was WRP Asia Pacific. Impact UK Limited successfully helped this company, another rubber glove manufacturer, to get their withhold release order uplifted. That was probably a couple months back. So our first reaction was, go find someone who actually had some help. So scrambled, and thankfully I got hold of Rosie's phone number And within that month itself, I would say, I think, Rosie, there was less than 2 weeks, I think, probably within a week. Very quickly, we sorted out the scope of works, what needed to be done. And now we listen to Impact's advice because they are an expert. They are third-party ethical trade consultant. They know what they're doing. And the rest is history. We just followed advice and one thing led to another. There's a series of actions that we need to do. And it's quite methodical.
So, Melissa, the problem was that you didn't really understand the full implications of the problem when it happened to you. You just didn't know how to approach this or to resolve the matter.
Exactly. I mean, we were like thinking who to talk to. That's the first thing. Sounds very basic. But I think today, any company, unfortunately, who is in that position, I think they are wiser than us. That's why since what has happened to us and we are free from WRO and finding, I have many companies, they come and approach us and very willingly I'll share experience because we do not wish for anyone to go through what we did.
And this, of course, was one of the main reasons why we were really pleased to have you speak at this year's forum, so that you could sort of share this experience, so that it acts as a warning to other companies, that hopefully they won't find themselves in a similar sort of situation. But if they do, you know, what are the implications of that? How serious that can be? Because obviously there were some very serious implications for your company, and we're going to come on and discuss those shortly. So, Melissa, it was important for you to receive external advice. That was what you felt was lacking, and that was what was needed. Did you get any help from the US government themselves, from those who had imposed the WRO on you?
First, I had to find out who to contact in the first place. I mean, Neil, I can tell you, we did everything. Google, everything, went to the embassy and everything. But one of my contacts from my previous organizations that I worked at gave me the email addresses, 2 email addresses of the CBP officials that we could email. That was the start. And they were very, very responsive. I think we managed to get on a call with them that night itself. I think it was the next day. It was 16, I still remember, midnight Malaysia time. And it was midday in US Standard Time. They were very quick. They explained to us what we went through. And they said, look, you just got to hang in there. There are a couple of things you need to do, etc., etc. And at the same time, I got hold of Rosie's phone number. And she guided us very carefully with her very experienced team who knew exactly what we had to do. We did a very complete investigation on the company's operations. That was the very first thing. I think the most important thing. Sorry,
Melissa. And the whole time, your goods were stopped at the US border. They were in a shipment waiting to be landed.
And you can imagine there is a lead time to ship goods from Malaysia to the US. It takes about 30 to 45 days. And can you imagine what's going to happen? You have things in transit on the way, you can't pull them back. Oh, it's horrible. Okay. 15 grueling months it took us to get us off. But it's an experience we'll remember for life, and very happy to share with anyone because we don't want anyone to go through what we did.
Thank you, Melissa. So, Rosie, you were Melissa's guardian angel in this situation, perhaps. So, and you obviously have more experience of that. So, and I should have mentioned when I introduced it that your organisation are a business consultancy who specialise in business and human rights risks for companies. So, what was it like working with Top Glove on this issue and getting to it seems that what was needed was a shared understanding of the issues, and what were the first steps that you felt that they needed to take?
Yes, thank you very much, Neil, and thanks, Melissa, and lovely to see you, Pauline. So I think the first important thing is for a company in this position to get a really good, impartial picture of what's going on. And as Melissa has said, I think when you first receive a WRO or the threat of a WRO, it's hard to see what that has to do with your operations, right? You then look up the definition of forced labour and you see it says all work or service that is exacted from any person under threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. And that's not very helpful, really. I mean, it doesn't really help you to understand what might be wrong and what you might need to do about it. What we recommend is looking at the 11 indicators of forced labour. And taking a long, hard and painful look at a company's own operations when it comes to these indicators and thinking about whether any of the things happening in the company could be interpreted to fall under those 11 indicators.
Sorry, Rosie.
Yes.
These are the ILO indicators,
yes.
And it was the ILO definition that you read from just now.
Absolutely, and those are the definitions that CBP tends to rely on. They tend to rely very much on ILO work in this area. So we're thinking about things like debt bondage, restriction of movement, withholding wages, retaining ID cards, abuse of vulnerability, deception, abusive living and working conditions, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, excessive overtime, and isolation. Now, what's very interesting about this is, unlike an audit where you're looking at comply, not comply with a standard, with this, you're looking to see whether workers feel any of these things or experience any of these things. So it's a significant mind shift for a company. And the journey with Melissa and everyone at Top Glove was, it's a very big company with a lot of production sites, was to try and understand which of these things could be the case where, and then make a very detailed action plan to sort it out. And I think, as Mel has shown us, if you are under WRO, the business implication is massive because it basically has a stranglehold on your sales. Which means that the kind of level of concentration needed and the level of urgency needed is much higher than it is for a standard remediation program or action plan or whatever it might be to close off non-compliances. And I have to say that the team at Top Glove astounded us with their ability to respond swiftly. I'm not saying there was never any argument, because there was a lot of argument, because sometimes it's unpleasant truths. And sometimes also we may have misjudged the situation. So there was a kind of a good degree of interaction. But we landed fairly quickly on a remediation plan. And then the story went on from there. But I think I commend Top Glove for taking hold of the agenda. Rather than going straight for denial and rebuttal, their first action was to take a look at it and really understand how it could be that this had happened, what practices were happening that could be interpreted in this light, and then take a long, hard look at that and take action. And I really commend that. It's excellent.
So, Melissa, did your company not have policies in place? Was it implementation of those policies, or were your policies just lacking enough detail, or were your policies not comprehensive enough? Where was the company at? Surely you must have had something in place.
Certainly, Neil. We have policies, but clearly for us to get into WRO situation, it was not up to par, I would say, not up to the standard that's required. And we just took a good hard look, because the 11 ILO forced labor indicators, first and foremost, we had to figure out which one of it that we didn't do so good at. So instead of cherry picking, we did all. We got Rosie's team in to check everything from every single indicator and see where the gaps are. And for a company with the kind of workforce that we have about 20,000 people, and out of that, probably about close to 70% is workers, and foreign workers probably about 55 to 60%. So that's a huge number, and we just had to go through. And sometimes, for a company as large as ours, you never know. There may be some pockets where we could have done better. So as what Rosie said, it's not the time to deny and say, look, that's not us. Sometimes things happen. But most importantly, what CBP wants to see is how fast and how swift company takes action, do remedial action, corrective action plan, and what is it we can do to prevent similar occurrences from happening. So where the controls are in place.
Just to add a little bit more detail to the story, I understand that a large number of the migrant workers employed in your operations came from Bangladesh, and a large number of them, if not all of them, were paying recruitment fees to secure work in your factories.
Okay, there's a little bit of history on this, Neil. If you go back history in Malaysia and how we hire foreign workers, it's a G-to-G arrangement, government-to-government arrangement. So for each particular year, government would tell a company like ours that, look, for this year, you can bring in X number of workers from X country. So it's not for us to choose from any other country that we wish to, but there is a quota that's allocated. As to the extent of these money that the workers, well, at the end of it, we found out after Impact came in to do all the investigation, we were not aware. Although back in January 2019, when there was an article that came out to our attention, the Guardian article in December 2018 about the risk of some of our workers that may have paid some fees unknown to us. So immediately the next month, in January 1st, 2019, our company implemented the zero-fee recruitment program. What zero-fee recruitment program means is the worker does not need to pay any single cent from the time they leave the source country right up to the time they arrive in Malaysia at our top left doorsteps. But clearly, this was not good enough. CBP wanted us to clean up the shop, so to speak, and that's what we did.
So the first steps that you took to resolve the problem, and I think we've already mentioned it, but it was engagement at executive level and a determination not to be half-hearted about that. You were going to look at all 11 ILO indicators.
Yes, certainly. We had our board at our back. We had our chairman, our executive management, everyone. We had daily meetings. I was the project lead for this initiative. Daily, we must have daily progress and update. And Rosie's right. Some of our conversations are not pleasant because we want everyone to work faster at our pace. But what I found was useful because of the different time zone that we lived in. It helped because when I got any instruction from CBP on what we need to do, I'll go back to Rosie's team who's in UK time zone to fix things. And then when it comes to nighttime, which is my nighttime in Malaysia, US would have just woken up. So it's perfect. So we're living in Malaysia, UK and US time zone. So things moved fairly quickly, I felt, because of that.
I think it was clearly a very pressing issue to be resolved as well, of course. And I understand that one of the first steps that you took was to produce a report. Could you talk us through that?
Correct. Yes. That report was produced by Impact. So I must say, Rosie's team took, I think, about 6 weeks around that time to complete a very comprehensive report. Obviously, again, shock and disbelief when you get a report. But today I can share with everyone that Top Glove, we've been very transparent. Our company policy is honesty, integrity, and transparency. And you can see even in our website, we show clearly from the day one, the first report, we call it the colored chart because some areas had not green, but the colors were like amber, or in some areas pink or even red, which means we needed quicker and faster action to remedy the part. And it showed also the journey, how we went on to do corrective action plan. Rosie's team stepped in along the way to ensure until we're all clear. By January 2021, we were Rosie's team confirmed we were free from systemic forced labor. But our company, we did not stop at our tracks. CBP never told us that you need to be all green before we uplift you, but we didn't stop. We did it on our own accord. We did not need CBP to tell us where we need to be because we just continued on. And then by April, our board and chairman, executive management decided that, look, we will pay the balance of remediation sum that we promised that we'll pay the workers. We were paying an installment plan, but we decided that, look, we'll pay in one lump sum. That was in April 2021. And not long after that, Rosie's team came in to check us, all the forced labor indicator, and confirm we were all green. And that particular year itself, in September the 10th, 2021, we received the good news from CBP that we were modified. And in July this year, 2022, CBP has also given us a bonus. They removed our name, Top Glove name, from the WRO and Finding webpage on CBP. So if today anyone Googles our name on the webpage, you won't find our name there anymore. So that was a bonus, a surprise pleasant bonus by CBP.
Thanks, Melissa. So just to sort of recap, the important thing was to find out where the issues were most acute. And one of those, has been already talked about it a little bit, was the payment of recruitment fees by migrant workers. But I understand that worker accommodation was also a priority for action.
Correct. Yes. And during that time, if I could refresh everyone's memory, we were going through COVID as well, and the Malaysian government, in a bid to fight COVID and to make sure that everyone, the foreign workers particularly, were living in better working conditions, there was a new act called the Act 446. That was gazetted as law in Malaysia. To make things more complicated, as we're going through the CPP journey, this new law was enacted and it applied to our industry. Previously, it was only for plantation, a learning curve for us as well, because we had to make sure the measurements of our workers, of the living conditions, met up to mark. That included measurement of the mattresses. It was a whole host of things. What was very meaningful for me was I went on to the ground together with our teams. Everyone in the company was involved, from the HR teams to factory to everyone, compliance, legal, everyone was on the ground helping each other to ensure that, look, we all met the law and ensure that this thing would sustain and continue until today. It was a massive, massive exercise.
And an expensive one. I'd imagine that undertaking this remediation, in particular repayment of and reimbursement to migrant workers of fees, was quite substantial. When you and I were talking previously, you did mention a figure. I wonder, are you allowed to share that now?
I think I can share the figure, ballpark number. The ballpark number is about $38.5 million US, and that's just remediation. That does not include all the improvements that we have done on the hostels and a host of other things. I would safely say we did spend over US$, I don't know, 150 million or more easily. Because we've also acquired and purchased new hostel accommodation for our workers, because clearly there wasn't enough accommodation in Malaysia, especially with the new law that was being gazetted. It was not just Top Glove looking for accommodation for our workers. Everyone else was. Everyone was scrambling.
And you also mentioned to me about a sinking fund. I had never come across that before. Perhaps you could also just explain what the sinking fund was.
Sure. So while we had completed all the remediation for our active workers and some workers where they had left Top Glove already, we thought that was not good enough. So upon a good advice from Rosie's office, we set up a sinking fund for anyone they may have missed the deadline to put in their claims. If they could put in their claims and we verify they were indeed a worker of Top Glove within the certain criteria, then they would receive the remediation sum.
Thank you.
So that was like an add-on.
Just to make sure that you can pick up the bits that get dropped or missed on
Correct.
the way to full remediation.
Correct.
Yeah. Pauline, situations like that faced by Top Glove send shockwaves far wider than those directly involved. Since your initial experience with the rubber glove sector in Malaysia and looking at issues like this, does it make you change your approach and policy? Does it make you focus attention on particular sectors? I guess these things are warnings to us all, but we never know unless we're really, really careful and undertaking as much due diligence as possible where these situations will arise. What's your experience of that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think this has affected both our approach to these risks, but also our policies, or rather contract terms. I mean, for us, it's very easy to point fingers at our suppliers. But I mean, we should really look at our own policies and processes, because this is a shared responsibility. So, now, together with the National Procurement Agency and other central purchasing body, we are enforcing new contract clauses that actually include remedy to fully align with the UN guiding principles, but also the OECD guidelines. And this is very new for public procurement. So this means really that, if the supplier has caused or contributed to an adverse impact, such as, forced labor, the supplier should restore the affected right holders to like the situation that it was before. But they also need to consult the right holders on appropriate remedy, because now we're talking about economic compensation, but there could also be other things like a public apology, restitution, etc. And the third thing is that, they also need to assess whether the affected right holders are satisfied, both with the process, but also the outcome of the process. So this is completely new. So we're launching these new contract clauses in November, but of course, together with support material guidance, both for public procurement agencies and to help suppliers. And the other thing I would like to mention is that, you really, as a public procurement, you have to know which specific risk to focus on, since a general audit, like a factory audit, is not geared at detecting these specific risks, such as forced labor, and different risks require different measures and competences to identify. We were talking about the ILO indicators for forced labor, for example. So here, I think it's really important that, if you want to commission like an auditor, you need to find the competencies and the methodologies. They must be adapted to the risk at hand. So here, I think we have done a learning curve as well to change the way we conduct follow-ups, for example. So yes, this has affected both our policies, contract clauses, and the way we approach this issue.
So having a policy effectively really these days isn't enough. You need to be able to demonstrate how you are implementing that policy and accepting that not everything works the way that we would hope it will in this world, having an effective grievance mechanism so that if you are found to be outside of guiding principles, that you can that workers have some form of redress and a properly and effective managed and transparent process for those workers to be remediated.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
These are the things that you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, no company can ever promise that there will be no violations of human rights in their supply chains. But what they can have in place is a robust due diligence process. And that is what we're looking for. So the first thing, if we find something, is to work with the supplier to corrective actions. So, terminated contracts is never the first thing that, anyone should do.
And we talked earlier, and you mentioned earlier about that you mostly deal with wholesalers, of course. Do you feel that this is going down through the supply chain? Do the wholesalers try and push this down as far as they can, or is there a point where your influence, for instance, comes to an end?
Yeah, no, I think this is a bit of a complicated matter, because the whole UN guiding principle is about not trickling down the responsibility. This is a shared responsibility. Each part in the supply chain has the responsibility. But we have struggled with our direct suppliers because they haven't really seen their responsibility for these kind of issues. And also when we're trying to say that, they could increase their leverage by working together, sometimes it can be difficult for competitors to sit in the same room to address the same thing. But I think this is also a way forward, either going into industry alliances or something like that to address these, because these are common challenges that needs to take a common approach to.
So a collective approach increases your leverage over the supplies. Yeah. Rosie, what impacts has this work had on the glove sector more generally in Malaysia and on migrant workers across Southeast Asia and maybe the Gulf? How have you striven to capture and sort of disseminate the learnings from this work?
Yes, I mean this piece of work, this sort of joint approach that Top Glove and Impact took, I think, has been very influential. There have been more WROs in Malaysia, and Melissa, I'm sure, will talk more about that than I can. But I think which shows that these issues are systemic, right? So this is not a question of a bad actor doing bad things. This is about a situation driven by a huge number of different forces, which results in these forced labour indicators being present in a pretty widespread way across Malaysia, but also across neighbouring countries and into the Gulf. So let's be clear about that. A shared problem needs a shared solution. What we found going into this piece of work was that there were absolutely no guidance or policies available publicly on how to do remedy. Because I think many companies have felt that this is a very private matter. They wanted to keep it under NDA, which means that there was no opportunity to learn from what other people had done, to learn from their mistakes and to build on that. So actually, with Melissa's knowledge and consent, what we did was came up with a set of guidelines specifically on the repayment of recruitment fees to try to drive better practice in this area. And we have undertaken a huge consultation exercise, and these are now, I think, fairly widely accepted into the industry as a whole, which means that companies can now avoid the necessity of the pain that Top Glove went through by, at least on the recruitment fees, following some fairly simple guidance. It's not a cheap matter, but it's a matter that needs to be addressed. So that has been the first key thing, I think, and we've seen actually a lot of repayment now done without the kick of the WRO across a lot of sectors across the countries I mentioned. The second thing, of course, is Top Glove is a company with deep pockets, and particularly at the time of COVID, obviously sales were rocketing because everyone needed rubber gloves. So it was possible for Top Glove to fund the remediation themselves out of money that they had. Now, this is often not the case, and as we look into a recession, it's unlikely to be the case in the future. So the other bit of work that we're working on is developing new ways of financing repayment. And there's another session, Neil, later on in this forum on that. So do have a look because that will give some more information about moves afoot to share the cost, to share the burden, but also to speed up the timing even further by access to capital for repayment of recruitment fees. So I think those are the two key things that collectively have come out.
And in particular, you know, that timely remediation for migrant workers is so important, particularly in the situation where they have to pay recruitment fees, because of course the whole time that they are indebted, the amounts sort of rise. You also mentioned the pain that company, the sort of pain threshold maybe for companies around these issues, and that paying attention to these things right from the get-go in advance is generally cheaper than having to undertake a repayment program or rectify things when situations have gone wrong.
Absolutely. I think having to do it fast when you're under WRO increases the pain, but also the burden of proof which CBP requires to demonstrate that there is not one single person in your operation who is still experiencing systemic forced labour indicators. That's a very big ask. And it needs an enormous and thoroughgoing plan to do that, because you've not only got to do it, you've got to prove it well beyond reasonable doubt. And that is, I think, the main reason for going early. So if you're operating in a sector or in a country where these issues are common, really take that long, hard look that I was talking about earlier, as if you were CBP looking at your own operations or supply chain. Because I think it's cheaper and easier and less painful to do it yourself ahead. Now that we know so much about it, which we didn't know 3 years ago, now we know so much more about it, I think it should be possible for companies to take preemptive action. And Melissa is extremely kind to share her learning in this way so as to help people to do this.
And Rosie, something that I'm now aware of is that even when you get a WRO listed, those goods are forever effectively tainted, and you will not get access into the market for where they were intended.
Absolutely. So what a WRO means is that any goods from you are stopped at the border. You can re-export them. If you get a finding, which is the next sanction above WRO, those goods are seized, so you can't re-export them. But the point is this, that unless you can prove that it's all been a terrible mistake and there's never been a single worker in an operation who has ever suffered any of the indicators of forced labour, which, trust me, is not possible to do in any circumstance. Unless you're able to do that, it means that those goods are effectively banned until all goods you manufacture are effectively banned until the date of the lifting of the WRO or finding. From that date, those goods are held to be clean, whereas those previous goods can never get into the United States. And of course, remember that the EU is about to announce some sort of action on selling goods made by forced labour across the EU, and other countries are also tightening up their stance on this. And in the UK, we have a new procurement bill which makes similar provisions, which means that the market access for goods which are under suspicion is really shrinking, which I think it provides quite a strong economic argument for going early. And I'm sure Melissa would agree. Knowing what we know now, we would have gone earlier, right?
Absolutely. Don't wait until you have WRO hanging on your neck.
Yeah.
So, Melissa, I mean, we now see some WROs on other Malaysian companies, and most recently, an Indian garment manufacturer has had a WRO put upon them. So, what advice would you give to companies facing allegations of forced labour, or indeed any company, maybe with a migrant workforce? What are the key things that people should be proactively looking out for in these situations?
Okay, I think Rosie has half answered the question, and I'll repeat that. If you operate in an environment where there could be suspicion of such forced labor indicators, any of the 11 of them, quickly engage a third-party auditor, an ethical trade consultant like Impact, and it could be Impact or any other company, but for us, we chose Impact because they had proved themselves to do a thorough investigation and clean up your shop if you do identify any missing gaps, and make sure that you put in the policies in place or strengthen the policies and continue to monitor them and review. It's not something that you do one time and you move on and think that's great, I'm good. And it also helps to get buy-in from the highest level in the company, which is what we did at Top Glove. So for us, our board sustainability committee actually has an oversight over our social compliance practices, and it goes right through to the last common denominator in our company, and we'll continuously review until today. This is very close to our hearts because we want to ensure that such occurrences does not happen anymore. So my advice would be get in expert advice, third-party expert advice fast and early.
If we look at the sector as a whole, it seems to me that all companies need to better factor in the true cost of labour and recruitment. The trouble is that we end up with some companies operating at one standard, some companies operating at another, different costs. But the true cost of labour and the recruitment of migrant workers isn't perhaps being properly factored into the price of finished goods right the way across the board. How do you think that you can begin to work to a common standard with your peer and competitor companies?
Absolutely, Neil. I think it's very important for everyone to be on a level playing field, which unfortunately is not the case. We have done all we could and all we can, but it doesn't mean that everyone in the industry has done that. We hope that in time to come, the industry body, the associations and whatnot, could come up with a uniform guideline for everyone to adhere to. So this way, everyone is operating on the level playing field. It also gives our buyers comfort that whoever that they speak to procure their goods, they have peace of mind instead of the buyers having to do their own due diligence, which is another burden on them. So hopefully, in time to come, we will move towards that.
And do you think that there's an important role for government there? I mean, what could the government of Malaysia and potentially the government in this case of Bangladesh be doing to ensure that workforces are free from forced labour and trafficking?
Absolutely. We need government support very much to make sure everyone is on the level playing field. So I think on both parties, from the source country and also the receiving country. So source country could be in Nepal or Bangladesh or any other country. The receiving country, like for us, will be in Malaysia. So both countries, government of both countries must work hand in hand to ensure that these are the standards that you adhere to. Like for us today, as we are in post-pandemic stage, we're starting to bring in foreign workers. Personally, I'm overseeing that process because I've become so passionate about ensuring that, look, what is it that we promise, impact that we'll do, as well as CBP. So I think this is something that not only company ourselves that we are monitoring, we hope that the government would also say, look, this is the standards that everybody must adhere to. For example, to recruit a new worker, what are the steps that must be taken, etc., etc., etc. The due diligence process, I'm quite sure not everyone is following through. For us, we do because we went through the pain ourselves. But I think it will be very good if everyone does it so that the buyer, someone like Pauline, has peace of mind.
Exactly so, and of course, the government of Malaysia and elsewhere, are subject to, they've signed the ILO forced labour protocol. They are subject to whatever tier that they are in the US TIP report, and as Rosie mentioned, we're increasingly going to see similar legislation in the EU as well now. So for the Malaysian government, there must be plenty of incentive to help businesses trying to operate in Malaysia, and I think that sometimes this gets forgotten. It's obviously, and the priority is to protect workers, in this case migrant workers, from being exploited, but it also protects law-abiding businesses who are trying to do the right thing and operate to a higher standard.
Exactly, absolutely. So I look forward to the day where there are standards that must be adhered to. And if you don't meet the standard, sorry, you can't export. Simple as that. So we need that kind of resolve and determination. I'm quite sure we'll get to that if everybody has the same resolve and determination.
Thank you. Rosie, as we listen to this, what would you point out as key takeaways and the sort of bigger picture here?
Yes, I mean, it's a cautionary tale. But a cautionary tale which could have hit any one of thousands of companies around the region and around the world. And that's why it's incredibly good of Mel to be sharing all of this. I mean, I think from my side, being able, for management to be able to look at their operations in a clear-eyed fashion in order to see whether or not it could ever be said by anyone that things are not quite right, to take note of activist or NGO campaigning. It doesn't mean you need to agree with it, but what could be the fire that is causing that smoke? And is that in any way to do with you? So rather than being offended and taking umbrage, just thinking, hang on a minute, is there a grain of truth in here? Rather than being offended about it. I think those two things of real clear-sighted self-analysis are very, very important. I think another area which is super important is capturing the views of workers, because as I said on the way in, this isn't about compliance with a standard. This is about whether workers are feeling and experiencing those indicators. And there's only one lot of people who can tell you that, which is workers. And so often you might hear, well, these people are lucky to have a job here. It's much nicer than it is back home, or at home, their accommodation isn't very nice. This is better than what they have there. But there you're kind of putting words in their mouth. And you hear that a lot. Genuinely asking workers about their experiences is very important. And the second thing, which actually was done very well in Top Glove, is, of course, an ongoing internal grievance system. So we ran the grievance system actually. So I've got logs and logs and logs and logs of thousands of calls. And some of the calls are saying, look, this is wrong. A lot of the calls are saying, I've got my money back, but my friend who left last year hasn't. How do they apply? And then people phoning up and say, thank you very much. And then other people raising other issues, which were perhaps not directly linked with forced labour, but linked with some other aspect of working at Top Glove. And all of that is absolutely priceless management information that helps a company to be a better company, unlock productivity benefits, for example, ensure that workers stay for longer because they want to stay for longer because their problems are being addressed. And also, if you do get in any form of trouble with people like CBP, you can show them the logs and you can show them how you have acted in each of those cases. So I think it's it's turning a kind of a horrible thing you have to do to your advantage. So you think, oh, grievance, what a nightmare, doing this is really, really hard work. But actually, it was probably Top Glove's strongest defence in their submission to CBP, not only that they paid all this money back, but they had evidence to show that they were solving workers' problems as they arose, moving forward into the future. So that's how I think the whole area of grievance and the whole area of remedy interlock.
And so it's about proper engagement with those concerns rather than just and we all see a host of various worker focused apps and things that call in and collect information, but it's about how a company then engages with those grievances. That's at the heart of it.
And I think just note, we have Mel here. Is Mel head of sustainability? No. Is she head of HR? No. She's very senior in the finance team. So that is like the heart of a business. And so, if finance says do something, you do something. So Mel led a team across the whole business in order to, and so Mel there in the finance team was saying, we've got to sort these grievances. We've got to have this sinking fund. We've got to do all of these things in order really, really, really to be able to demonstrate, to make change and then be able to demonstrate change. So I think that is also really key to the whole thing, because this isn't pretending to do something or doing something for the form or doing something because someone's asked you to do it or to get more business. This is doing something because if the firm is to survive, it must change. And that's why it's so powerful. And of course, my worry is there are many, many companies out there who haven't heeded the warning signs. And increasingly, it's going to be necessary to make these changes to be able to compete. So I'd say thank you, Mel, for sharing so honestly, not only what you did, but how you did it, because it was quite a show, I can tell you.
Today we can Rosie. Smile, right, Rosie?
We can smile today.
Today, not back then.
Not back then.
Okay. Well, Melissa, maybe it's fair to give the last word to you. The title of this session is The Road to Remedy. So, what is it that you think you've learned on this journey? What are the key takeaways?
Very kind of you, Neil. I thought a bit about what I wanted to share with the audience before we end this session. I've got 3 points I'd like to share here. First, ignorance is not bliss. So ignorance is not an excuse, okay? And once you know it, do it right, do it fast, okay? And be consistent and make it sustainable.
Thank you. That's. I think that there's something there for everyone at every function, every part of every country across all supply chains. Every company, across all supply chains. It's this situation is not unique to the rubber glove industry, to Malaysia, or to Top Glove themselves. We can find very similar examples right the way across the piece. Thank you very much. So it only remains really for me to thank our 3 panelists for this webinar session. Melissa, Pauline, and Rosie, thank you so much for taking part and for your insights into this really important part of the sort of effective management of grievance and remedy for migrant workers. There's clearly still a lot more work to be done, and it's by sharing experience that we all learn how to undertake more effective sort of business practices to ensure that we treat migrant workforces with the dignity and respect that they're due. So thank you all very much for taking part. If you've enjoyed this discussion, as Rosie mentioned, we have 2 further sessions on financing responsible recruitment. So please do check those out in the Global Forum portal. And also please feel free to add to the social media feeds that are connected to the forum, and have a look at some of the other sessions that we're featuring in this year's forum. All of the webinar sessions and the presentations for the insights sessions will be available not just during the forum, but for quite some time afterwards. So please do check out and see if you can find all sorts of more interesting information about the way that migrant workers are recruited. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you very much for tuning in. Goodbye.